The Great Hall of Centrum Prime had stood for 12,000 years, and in all that time, it had never witnessed anything quite like this moment. Ambassador Kethril of the Velori Empire sat upon his floating throne of pure light, watching the massive doors at the far end of the chamber swing open with a sound like distant thunder, and he allowed himself a thin smile of amusement at what he saw entering. Humans, the youngest species to ever request an audience with the Galactic Council, walked into the hall with their backs straight and their heads held high, as if they actually believed they belonged here among the elder races who had ruled the stars since before humanity's ancestors had learned to walk upright. There were 12 of them in total, dressed in their simple black uniforms with silver trim, and at their head walked a woman of medium height with dark hair pulled back in a tight knot and eyes that seemed to take in everything around her without revealing anything in return. Admiral Yuki Tanaka, the humans called her, and she was supposedly the finest military mind their little species had ever produced. Kethril nearly laughed out loud at the thought. The Galactic Council consisted of 12 elder species, each of whom had achieved faster-than-light travel at least 50,000 years ago, and most of whom commanded fleets numbering in the millions of warships, and here came humanity with barely a century of spacefaring experience, requesting, no, practically demanding, a seat at the table. The other council members shifted in their seats as the human delegation approached the central platform, and Kethril could sense their mixture of curiosity and contempt through the psychic link that connected all Velori minds. High Commander Zerath of the Kreth Empire leaned forward in his massive chair, his insectoid eyes glittering with barely concealed disdain, and his mandibles clicked together in what passed for laughter among his kind. The Kreth had waged war across the galaxy for 50,000 years, and they had never once been defeated in open combat, and the idea that these soft, fragile creatures thought they could stand alongside such warriors was almost too absurd to consider. "The Council recognizes the delegation from Earth," announced the speaker, an ancient artificial intelligence that had moderated these gatherings since before most of the current species had evolved sentience. Admiral Tanaka stepped forward and offered a slight bow that managed to convey respect without submission, and when she spoke, her voice was calm and measured. "Honored members of the Galactic Council, I come before you today on behalf of the United Earth Government to formally request consideration for membership in the Defensive Alliance Pact." A ripple of whispered conversation passed through the chamber, and several of the ambassadors exchanged glances that ranged from amused to openly mocking. "The human admiral wishes to join our alliance," said Ambassador Thesic of the Syndicate of Eos, his serpentine body coiling with poorly suppressed laughter. "How delightful!" "Perhaps she does not understand what she is asking," added Matriarch Eril of the Communion, her 4 arms spreading wide in a gesture of false sympathy. "The poor creatures have only been traveling between stars for such a short time." Admiral Tanaka remained perfectly still, her expression betraying nothing, as the council members continued to talk about humanity as if the delegation was not standing right there in front of them. Kethril decided it was time to address the matter directly, and he raised one hand to silence the murmuring crowd. "Admiral Tanaka," he said, his voice resonating through the chamber with the weight of ancient authority, "the Council has reviewed Earth's application with great interest, and we appreciate your species' desire to contribute to galactic security." He paused, savoring the moment, knowing what was coming next. "However, we must be realistic about what humanity can actually offer this alliance." With a wave of his hand, he activated the holographic display at the center of the chamber, and suddenly the air was filled with glowing images and statistics that detailed Earth's military capabilities. "Your species currently maintains a navy of approximately 200 warships," Kethril continued. "The smallest fleet represented in this council numbers over 3 million vessels." More laughter rippled through the chamber, and High Commander Zerath's mandibles clicked faster in amusement. Your weapons technology is based primarily on kinetic projectiles and primitive nuclear devices, Kethril went on. You have no energy shields, no plasma arrays, no dimensional displacement drives, and no antimatter weapons. He let the words hang in the air for a moment before delivering what he considered the final blow. Furthermore, our analysis indicates that your species is still engaged in internal conflicts on your homeworld, which suggests a troubling lack of unity that would make you unreliable partners in any serious military alliance. Admiral Tanaka listened to all of this without any visible reaction, and when Kethril finished speaking, she simply nodded once as if accepting the assessment. I appreciate the Council's thorough analysis of our capabilities, she said, and her voice remained steady despite the mockery that surrounded her. May I ask what level of development would be required for Earth to be reconsidered for membership in the future? This question prompted another round of laughter, louder this time, and several of the ambassadors did not even bother to hide their amusement. My dear Admiral, said Ambassador Thesic, his forked tongue flickering with condescension, perhaps in another 10,000 years, when your species has had time to mature, we might revisit this conversation. If your species survives that long, added High Commander Zerath, and his compound eyes seemed to glitter with cruel humor. So many young races burn themselves out before they reach true civilization. The laughter that followed this comment filled the entire chamber, echoing off the crystalline walls and washing over the human delegation like a wave of contempt. Kethril watched Admiral Tanaka's face carefully, expecting to see anger or humiliation or perhaps desperate pleading, but instead he saw something that he did not quite understand. The human admiral was smiling. It was not a smile of embarrassment or forced politeness, but something else entirely, something that made Kethril feel suddenly and inexplicably uneasy. I thank the Council for its time and consideration, Admiral Tanaka said, and she bowed once more before turning to lead her delegation back toward the great doors. As the humans walked away, their footsteps echoing in the vast chamber, Matriarch Errol leaned toward Kethril with a look of satisfaction on her pale features. Well, that was entertaining, she said. Do you think they actually believed they had a chance? Kethril did not answer immediately, because he was still thinking about that strange smile on the human admiral's face. They are a peculiar species, he finally said, but ultimately irrelevant in the grand scheme of galactic affairs. He turned his attention to the next item on the Council's agenda, already forgetting about the humans and their absurd request. After all, what could such a young and primitive race, possibly, have to offer the mighty civilizations that had ruled the stars for millennia? The great doors closed behind the human delegation with a sound like a final judgment, and the Council moved on to more important matters, confident in their superiority and secure in their ancient power. They had no way of knowing that in 3 short months, everything they believed about themselves and the galaxy would be shattered beyond repair. They had no way of knowing that the species they had just dismissed as irrelevant would soon become the only thing standing between them and total annihilation. And they certainly had no way of knowing that the calm, quiet woman they had mocked and belittled would one day speak a single sentence that would change the course of galactic history forever. But all of that was still in the future, and for now, the Council laughed at Earth, secure in the belief that they had seen the last of humanity's foolish ambitions. They were wrong. They were so very, very wrong. 3 months after the humans left Centrum Prime in disgrace, the laughter stopped. It began with silence from the Outer Rim colonies, where communication relays went dark one by one like candles being snuffed out by an invisible hand, and at first the Council assumed it was merely a technical failure of some kind. Then the refugees started arriving. Ships packed with terrified civilians from a dozen different species, came flooding into the core systems, bringing with them stories that the Council initially dismissed as hysteria and exaggeration. They spoke of metal nightmares that descended from the void between galaxies, of ships the size of moons that swallowed entire fleets without slowing down, of worlds being stripped bare of all life and resources in a matter of hours. They spoke of the harvesters. Kethfril sat in the council chamber and listened to the emergency reports with growing disbelief, because what he was hearing should not have been possible. The harvesters were supposed to be a myth, a legend from the ancient times before the elder races had risen to power, a cautionary tale told to frighten young species into respecting the dangers of the universe. But myths did not destroy 17 colony worlds in a single week. Myths did not annihilate a Kreth battle group of 40 warships without losing a single vessel. Myths did not send the proud Valori Empire scrambling to evacuate its outer territories like frightened children running from a storm. "We must consider the possibility that the historical records were accurate," said Matriarch Errol, and her voice trembled with something that Kethfril had never heard from her before: fear. The ancient texts spoke of the harvesters as a machine collective from beyond the galactic rim, a vast artificial intelligence that had been created by some long-dead species millions of years ago, and had since evolved into something far beyond its original purpose. They did not conquer, they did not negotiate, and they did not show mercy. They simply consumed. Every 10,000 years, according to the oldest records, the harvesters would return to the galaxy to feed, stripping entire star systems of useful materials and organic matter, before retreating back into the darkness to process their harvest and grow stronger. The last time they had come, the galaxy had been populated by different species entirely, civilizations whose names had been forgotten, and whose worlds were now nothing but barren rocks orbiting dead stars. And now they had returned. "How long do we have?" asked High Commander Zerath, and his mandibles clicked nervously as he studied the tactical display that showed the harvester advance. The answer came from the speaker, the ancient AI that had been present for the previous harvester incursion 10,000 years ago. "Based on current projections, the harvester fleet will reach the core systems within 18 standard months," the speaker announced. "Their numbers appear to exceed previous estimates by a factor of approximately 100. The chamber fell silent as the council members absorbed this information. 100 times more ships than the last incursion. 100 times more death. 100 times more certain doom. "We must coordinate our defenses," Kethfril said, forcing himself to sound calmer than he felt. "If we combine our fleets and establish a defensive perimeter around the core systems, we may be able to hold them off long enough to find a weakness." But even as he spoke, he could see the doubt in the eyes of his fellow council members, and he could feel the cracks already forming in the alliance that had held the galaxy together for thousands of years. Ambassador Thesic was the first to break. "The Syndicate of Eos will not commit our fleet to a battle we cannot win," he announced, his serpentine body coiling defensively. "We have already begun preparations to evacuate our population to the Andromeda Galaxy." "You would abandon us?" demanded High Commander Zerath, rising from his seat with fury in his compound eyes. "We would survive," Thesic replied coldly, "which is more than the rest of you will do if you stay here and fight an enemy that cannot be defeated." The argument that followed threatened to tear the council apart, as species that had been allies for millennia turned on each other in their desperation to survive. Some called for a united stand against the harvesters. Others demanded that each species be allowed to seek its own salvation. A few suggested that perhaps they could negotiate with the Machine Collective, offer them something in exchange for mercy, though no one could say what the harvesters might possibly want that they could not simply take. Through it all, Kethfril sat in silence, watching his carefully constructed political order crumble around him like a sand castle before the tide. And then, in the midst of the chaos, a new voice cut through the shouting. The Earth delegation requests permission to address the council. Every head in the chamber turned toward the entrance, where a familiar figure in a black uniform stood waiting with that same unreadable expression that Kethril remembered from 3 months ago. Admiral Yuki Tanaka had returned. "You dare show your face here at a time like this?" snarled High Commander Zrath, his anger at the Syndicate's betrayal finding a new target. "We are facing extinction, and you come to beg for scraps from our table once more." The Admiral did not flinch at the hostility in his voice. "I come to offer our assistance," she said simply. The laughter that followed was bitter and hollow, nothing like the confident mockery that had filled this chamber during her last visit. "Your assistance," repeated Matriarch Errol, and her voice cracked with something between hysteria and despair. "What assistance could your 200 primitive ships possibly provide against an enemy that just destroyed the pride of the Kreth Empire?" "We are aware of the situation," Admiral Tanaka replied, "and we believe we can help." Kethril studied the human with new eyes, searching for any sign of the fear that gripped the rest of the galaxy, but he found nothing. Only that same calm confidence that he had mistaken for naivety during their first meeting. "Why?" he asked, genuinely curious despite himself. "Why would you help us after the way we treated you?" The Admiral met his gaze directly, and for a moment Kethril felt as if she could see right through him. "Because it is the right thing to do," she said, "and because when this is over, you will remember who stood with you when the darkness came." The council chamber fell silent once more, but this time the silence was different. It was the silence of desperate people being offered a rope they were not sure they should grab. High Commander Zrath broke the moment with a harsh clicking sound that might have been a laugh or a curse. "Even if we accepted your offer, what could you possibly do?" he demanded. "Your ships are nothing against the harvesters." Admiral Tanaka smiled that strange smile again, the one that made Kethril feel uneasy in ways he could not explain. "Perhaps you should let us show you," she said, "before you decide what we are worth." Kethril looked around the chamber at his fellow council members, seeing the doubt and fear and desperation on their faces, and he realized that they had run out of options. The Syndicate was already preparing to flee. The Kreth had lost their best ships. The Velori homeworld was directly in the path of the Harvester advance. What did they have to lose by letting the humans try? "Very well, Admiral," he said slowly. "Earth may send a representative to our next strategic planning session, and we will hear what you have to propose." It was not acceptance, not really, but it was more than he had been willing to give 3 months ago. Admiral Tanaka bowed once, that same gesture of respect without submission, and turned to leave. As she walked away, Kethril found himself wondering what the humans thought they could accomplish against an enemy that had brought the mightiest civilizations in the galaxy to their knees. He would find out soon enough. They all would. The strategic planning session took place in a smaller chamber adjacent to the main council hall, where holographic displays covered every wall with maps and fleet positions, and endless streams of casualty reports that grew longer by the hour. Admiral Tanaka stood at the center of the room, surrounded by the military commanders of 11 species who looked at her, with expressions ranging from skeptical curiosity to open hostility. High Commander Zrath loomed over her like a mountain of chitin and muscle, his compound eyes fixed on her with the same disdain he might show a particularly annoying insect. "Speak then, human," he said, his mandibles clicking impatiently. "Tell us how your primitive fleet plans to save the galaxy." The Admiral activated her own holographic display, and a detailed map of the galactic rim appeared in the air before them. "The harvesters are advancing along 3 main corridors," she said, pointing to the invasion routes with a small laser pointer. Their pattern suggests they are attempting to encircle the core systems before beginning their final push. "We know this already," interrupted Fleet Marshal Vorn of the Communion, her forearms crossed in obvious annoyance. "Our analysts have been tracking their movements for weeks." "Then you also know that they have been avoiding direct confrontation with your main battle fleets whenever possible," Admiral Tanaka continued, unperturbed by the interruption. "They are picking off isolated colonies and supply lines while keeping their primary force in reserve." This observation caused a few of the commanders to exchange glances, because it was true, and it had been bothering them for some time. The harvesters should have been attacking everything in their path, but instead they seemed to be playing a longer game, wearing down the Council's forces through attrition rather than risking a decisive engagement. "They are smart," Admiral Tanaka said, "smarter than the historical records suggested, which means they have been learning and adapting over the past 10,000 years." "And what does this have to do with your offer of assistance?" demanded High Commander Zerath. The Admiral's expression remained calm as she outlined her proposal. "Earth is prepared to commit our entire fleet to the defense of the border worlds in Sector 7, she said. "This sector contains the primary refugee evacuation routes for the Velori outer colonies, and if it falls, millions of civilians will be cut off from escape." "Your entire fleet," repeated Fleet Marshal Vorn slowly. "You mean those 200 ships that could not even scratch the paint on a harvester cruiser?" 212 ships, actually," Admiral Tanaka corrected. "We have been building." The laughter that followed was not as loud as it had been in the main council chamber, but it carried the same bitter edge of contempt mixed with desperation. "You would sacrifice your entire species for people who mocked you and dismissed you?" asked Kethril, who had been observing the exchange from the corner of the room. Admiral Tanaka turned to face him directly. "We would fight for those who cannot fight for themselves," she said. "Is that not what an alliance is supposed to mean?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and several of the commanders shifted uncomfortably in their seats. High Commander Zerath stepped forward until he was towering directly over the human admiral, using his massive size to intimidate in a way that had worked on countless enemies over his long military career. "Let me explain something to you, human," he said, and his voice dripped with condescension. "My species has waged war across this galaxy for 50,000 years, and in all that time, we have never been defeated in open combat." He leaned down until his mandibles were mere inches from her face. "We have developed weapons that can crack planets in half and shields that can withstand the heat of a supernova, and even we are afraid of what is coming." His compound eyes glittered with something that might have been pity. "You have no shields at all, and your weapons are nothing more than metal slugs propelled by chemical explosions, which is technology that we abandoned before your species had learned to make fire." He straightened up and gestured at the holographic display, showing the harvester advance. "If you take your fleet to Sector 7, you will all die, and your deaths will accomplish nothing except to remove another 200 ships from the board." Admiral Tanaka listened to this speech without any visible reaction, and when the Kreth commander finished, she simply nodded as if accepting his assessment. "You may be right," she said, "but we are going to do it anyway." This response seemed to genuinely confuse High Commander Zerath, who had expected anger or argument or perhaps tears. "Why?" he demanded. "Why would you throw away your lives for nothing?" "Because they are our lives to throw away," Admiral Tanaka replied, "and because we do not believe it will be for nothing." She turned to address the entire room, her voice carrying clearly despite her small stature. "Humanity is requesting permission to deploy to Sector 7, and we are requesting it as a courtesy, not because we need your approval." "You would defy the Council's strategic planning?" asked Kethril, genuinely surprised. "We would fulfill the role you assigned us," the Admiral replied. You said we were too primitive to stand alongside your fleets, so we will stand alone in a sector that none of you want to defend." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Everyone in the room knew that Sector 7 was a lost cause, a region that the Council's strategic planners had already written off as indefensible, and the civilians trapped there had been quietly abandoned to their fate. And now the humans were volunteering to die defending it. "You are either very brave or very stupid," said Fleet Marshal Vorn finally. "Perhaps both." Admiral Tanaka smiled that strange smile again. "Perhaps," she agreed, "but we have been called worse things by better enemies." High Commander Zrath made a sound that might have been frustration or grudging respect. "Your ships will be destroyed within hours of engaging the Harvester fleet," he said. "You understand this, yes?" "We understand the odds," Admiral Tanaka replied. "And you are still willing to go?" "We are." The Kreth commander stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to solve a puzzle that did not make sense. "Then go," he said finally, waving one massive claw in dismissal. "Die in whatever manner pleases you, and perhaps your sacrifice will buy the evacuation convoys a few extra hours." He turned his back on her, clearly done with the conversation. "It will not matter in the end, of course, but if your species wishes to throw itself into the fire, the Council will not stop you." Admiral Tanaka bowed once more, that same gesture of respect without submission, and began to walk toward the door. She paused at the threshold and turned back to face the room one final time. "I hope we will have the opportunity to speak again, High Commander," she said, "after the battle." Zrath did not bother to turn around. "You will not," he said flatly, "because you will be dead." The Admiral said nothing in response, but as she left the chamber, Kethfril caught a glimpse of her expression. She was still smiling, and for reasons he could not explain, that smile made him more uneasy than all the Harvester fleet projections combined. Something was happening here that he did not understand, something that went beyond simple courage or foolish bravery. The humans knew something that the rest of them did not. He was certain of it. But what could a species of primitive warriors possibly know that had escaped the attention of civilizations thousands of times older and more advanced? Kethfril pushed the thought aside and returned his attention to the strategic displays. There were more important matters to worry about than the fate of 200 doomed ships. Or so he believed. He would soon learn how wrong he was. 1 week before the human fleet was scheduled to depart for Sector 7, Admiral Tanaka requested one final audience with the full Galactic Council. Kethfril almost denied the request, because what more could possibly be said, but something about the formal wording of the communication made him curious enough to agree. The Council assembled in the Great Hall once more, though the mood was very different from that first meeting months ago. Gone was the confident laughter and easy contempt. In its place was a heavy blanket of fear and uncertainty that seemed to press down on everyone present. The Harvester advance had accelerated in recent days, and 3 more core worlds had fallen silent, their populations either dead or worse. Admiral Tanaka entered the chamber alone this time, without the rest of her delegation, and she walked to the central platform with the same calm confidence she had shown in every previous encounter. "Honored members of the Council," she said, "I wish to show you something before my fleet departs." She raised her hand, and the holographic display system activated. But instead of fleet positions or tactical data, the images that appeared were something else entirely. They were scenes from Earth's history. The first image showed a beach covered with bodies and burning vehicles, as thousands of young men charged into a wall of gunfire that should have been impossible to survive. "This is a place called Normandy," Admiral Tanaka said. "During a conflict that my species called World War II, these soldiers attacked a fortified position knowing that most of them would die before they reached their objective. The image changed to show a frozen city reduced to rubble, where ragged soldiers fought hand to hand in the ruins of buildings that had once been homes. "This is Stalingrad, where my people fought for every street and every room for months on end, refusing to surrender even when logic and reason said they should." High Commander Zerath watched the footage with his compound eyes narrowed, trying to understand what he was seeing. The tactics were primitive, the weapons laughably outdated, but there was something about the way these humans fought that made him deeply uncomfortable. They did not retreat. They did not surrender. They simply kept coming, wave after wave, stepping over the bodies of their fallen comrades to continue the attack. The images continued, showing conflict after conflict across human history. Soldiers charging into cannon fire at a place called Gettysburg. Warriors holding a mountain pass against impossible odds at Thermopylae. Resistance fighters in jungles and mountains, using nothing but courage and improvised weapons against enemies with every advantage. Pilots deliberately crashing their damaged aircraft into enemy ships, choosing certain death over failure. "What is the purpose of this display?" demanded Ambassador Thesic, his serpentine body coiling with discomfort. "Are you trying to impress us with how often your species has killed itself?" Admiral Tanaka turned to face him directly. "I am showing you who we are," she said, "not what you assumed we were." The holographic display changed again, this time showing something that made several council members gasp in shock. It was footage of the first human nuclear test, a massive explosion that turned sand into glass and lit up the sky like a second sun. "My species developed the power to destroy our entire civilization before we had even left our own planet," Admiral Tanaka said. "We have lived with the knowledge of our own potential extinction for generations." More images followed. Mushroom clouds rising over cities. Radiation maps showing the potential aftermath of nuclear war. Computer simulations of extinction-level events. "We chose not to destroy ourselves," the Admiral continued, "not because we could not, but because we decided that survival was more important than victory." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Every generation of humans since that first nuclear test has grown up knowing that we could end our entire species with the push of a button, and every generation has chosen not to push it." Kethril found himself leaning forward in his seat, genuinely fascinated by what he was hearing. "You think this makes you special?" asked High Commander Zerath, though his voice lacked its usual contempt. "Many species have developed weapons capable of self-destruction." "Yes," Admiral Tanaka agreed, "but how many of those species continue to develop even more powerful weapons while simultaneously choosing not to use them?" The display showed the progression of human weapons technology over the past century. Hydrogen bombs thousands of times more powerful than the first nuclear devices. Biological weapons capable of wiping out entire continents. Chemical agents that could kill millions with a single release. "We built all of these things," Admiral Tanaka said, "and we kept building them generation after generation because we understood that the universe is dangerous and that someday we might need them." She looked around the chamber at the assembled council members. "You looked at our 200 ships and saw weakness," she said. "You looked at our kinetic weapons and saw primitives." Her voice hardened, taking on an edge that had not been there before. "You never bothered to ask why a species capable of building weapons that could crack our own planet in half would choose to arm our warships with simple metal slugs instead." The silence in the chamber was absolute. "We chose mercy," Admiral Tanaka said. "We chose restraint because we knew that once we started down the path of building weapons purely for destruction, there would be no turning back." She activated one final image on the holographic display. It showed a human warship, one of the 200 vessels that the Council had dismissed as worthless, but this time the technical specifications were visible. Hidden within the primitive hull were systems that the Council's analysts had never detected. Antimatter reactors that dwarfed anything the Valori had ever built. Dimensional displacement drives that could teleport entire squadrons across light years in an instant. And weapons that made the Kreth's planet-cracking technology look like children's toys. "We have had these capabilities for decades," Admiral Tanaka said quietly. "We simply chose not to use them." High Commander Zerath rose from his seat, his massive form trembling with something that might have been rage or fear or both. "You deceived us," he growled. "You let us believe you were weak while hiding your true strength." Admiral Tanaka met his gaze without flinching. "We showed you exactly what we wanted you to see," she said, "just as we have shown every species we have encountered since we first left our homeworld." She took a step toward the Kreth commander, and despite being less than half his size, she somehow seemed to fill the entire chamber with her presence. "You assumed that because we did not threaten you, we could not threaten you," she said. "You assumed that because we asked for peace, we were incapable of war." Her voice dropped to barely more than a whisper, but every being in the chamber heard her clearly. "You seem to have mistaken our mercy for weakness." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. Then Admiral Tanaka turned and began walking toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. She paused at the door and looked back over her shoulder. "My fleet departs for Sector 7 in 6 hours, she said. "Any Council vessels that wish to join us will be welcome." Then she was gone, leaving behind a chamber full of ancient beings who were only now beginning to understand how badly they had misjudged the youngest species in the galaxy. Kethvril sat in his floating throne, his mind racing as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. The humans had been playing a game that none of them had even recognized, hiding their true capabilities behind a mask of humility and restraint. And now, facing an enemy that threatened the entire galaxy, they had finally chosen to reveal themselves. Not as the primitive newcomers the Council had dismissed, but as something far more dangerous. Something that had been watching and waiting and preparing for this moment for a very long time. The question was no longer whether humanity could help save the galaxy. The question was whether the galaxy was ready for what humanity was about to become. The Battle of the Threshold Line began on a Tuesday by Earth's calendar, and it would be remembered for as long as any species in the galaxy survived to tell the tale. Admiral Tanaka stood on the bridge of the Defiance, watching the tactical display as the Harvester fleet emerged from hyperspace like a swarm of metal locusts blotting out the stars. There were millions of them, just as the intelligence reports had predicted, a wall of death and destruction that no force in galactic history had ever successfully opposed. Behind her, the crew worked their stations with calm efficiency, and not one of them showed any sign of fear. They had all volunteered for this mission, knowing what it would likely cost them, and they had made their peace with that cost long ago. "All ships report ready, Admiral," said Commander Chen from the tactical station. "The Council observers are requesting permission to withdraw to a safe distance." Tanaka smiled slightly at that. When her fleet had departed Centrum Prime, she had been surprised to find a small escort of Council vessels waiting to accompany them, sent by High Commander Zerath himself to witness whatever was about to happen. The Kreth commander had not come himself, but his flagship was among the observers, and Tanaka knew he would be watching every moment of the battle that was about to unfold. "Tell the observers they may position themselves wherever they feel most comfortable," she said, "and then open a channel to the fleet." A moment later, her face appeared on the screens of every human ship in the formation. "This is Admiral Tanaka," she said. "In a few minutes, we will engage an enemy that has never been defeated in 10,000 years of galactic history, and most of the beings who know about our mission believe we are going to our deaths." She paused, letting her words sink in. "They may be right, but if we die today, we die showing the galaxy what humanity is truly capable of, and we die protecting millions of innocent people who have no one else to fight for them." Her voice hardened with determination. "All ships, prepare to activate Phase 2 weapon systems on my command. And remember, we did not come here to survive." She looked directly into the camera, her eyes burning with a fire that had been kindled in her ancestors' hearts long before her species had ever dreamed of reaching the stars. "We came here to win." The channel closed, and Admiral Tanaka turned to face the approaching enemy fleet. "All hands," she said quietly, "battle stations." What followed would be analyzed and studied by military historians for generations to come, and none of them would ever be able to fully explain what they saw. The human fleet did not wait for the harvesters to attack. They charged. 200 ships against millions, racing toward the enemy formation at speeds that should have been impossible for vessels of their size, their primitive kinetic weapons opening fire in a storm of metal that would have been laughable against proper energy shields. But the humans were not aiming at the harvester ships themselves. They were aiming at something much smaller. The harvesters communicated through a network of relay drones that allowed their vast machine intelligence to coordinate across the entire fleet, and the humans had spent months studying captured data to identify exactly where those relays were positioned. The first volley of kinetic rounds, traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light, tore through the relay network like a scythe through wheat, and suddenly the harvester fleet was no longer a single coordinated entity. It was a collection of confused and disoriented individual ships, each one trying to re-establish communication with a network that no longer existed. And that was when the humans revealed their true weapons. Admiral Tanaka watched as the Defiance's antimatter cannons came online, weapons that her species had developed decades ago, but had never deployed in combat because they were simply too destructive for any war between civilized peoples. The first shot vaporized a harvester cruiser 3 times the size of her own ship. The second shot destroyed 2 more. By the time the harvesters understood what was happening, the human fleet had punched a hole through their formation that was dozens of kilometers wide. "All ships, execute Pattern Omega," Tanaka ordered, and her fleet scattered in every direction, each ship targeting a different section of the disorganized enemy formation. The Council observers watched in stunned disbelief as the primitive human vessels danced through the harvester fleet like wolves among sheep, their dimensional displacement drives allowing them to teleport short distances to avoid enemy fire, while their antimatter weapons carved paths of destruction through the machine armada. But the harvesters were not helpless, and they were not stupid. They began to adapt, creating local communication networks to replace the destroyed relays, coordinating their attacks against the human ships with increasing effectiveness. One by one, the human vessels began to fall. The S-Courage took a direct hit from a harvester beam weapon and exploded in a flash of antimatter annihilation that took 3 enemy ships with it. The S-Valiant was surrounded and boarded, and her crew detonated their reactor core rather than allow their ship to be captured. The S-Hope was torn in half by concentrated fire, but her surviving crew managed to crash the remains of their vessel into a harvester carrier, destroying both ships in the impact. 11 hours into the battle, less than half of the human fleet remained operational. But the harvester fleet had lost nearly a third of its total strength, a casualty rate that their strategic algorithms had deemed mathematically impossible. Admiral Tanaka's bridge was open to vacuum, several sections having been destroyed by enemy fire, and she stood in her emergency suit with one arm in a makeshift sling, still giving orders, still fighting. "Admiral, we are detecting a large-scale retreat vector forming in the Harvester fleet," reported Commander Chen, his voice crackling through the damaged communication system. Tanaka looked at the tactical display and saw that it was true. The Harvesters were withdrawing, pulling back toward the galactic rim in a pattern that suggested genuine strategic retreat rather than tactical repositioning. They had never retreated before. In 10,000 years of recorded history, no force had ever made them retreat. Until now. "All ships maintain pursuit," Tanaka ordered. "Do not let them regroup." The battle continued for another 3 hours as the surviving human vessels chased the retreating Harvesters across the sector, destroying stragglers and preventing any attempt to reform their communication network. When it was finally over, 31 human ships remained out of the original 212. The Harvester fleet that had threatened to consume the entire galaxy had been reduced to a scattered remnant, fleeing into the darkness beyond the rim. Admiral Tanaka opened a channel to the Council observers, who had watched the entire battle from a safe distance. "This is Admiral Tanaka of the Earth Fleet to Council observers," she said, her voice rough with exhaustion but still carrying that same calm authority. "The Harvester threat has been neutralized in this sector." She paused to look at the status reports, showing the devastation her fleet had suffered. Requesting permission to pursue. The channel was silent for a long moment, and then a voice that Tanaka recognized as High Commander Zrath came through the speakers. "Admiral Tanaka," the Kreth commander said slowly, "the Council would like to discuss the terms of Earth's full membership in the Galactic Alliance at your earliest convenience." Tanaka smiled, though there was little joy in the expression. "I believe we can find time for that discussion," she said, "after we finish dealing with the enemy." The alliance treaty was signed 1 week later, in the same great hall where the Council had laughed at Earth's first request. This time no one laughed. High Commander Zrath himself presented the document, and when Admiral Tanaka stepped forward to accept it on behalf of humanity, the Kreth commander did something that shocked everyone present. He bowed. "We were wrong about your species," he said quietly, so that only she could hear. "We saw what you showed us and assumed it was all there was to see." Admiral Tanaka looked up at the massive warrior, who had once dismissed her people as irrelevant primitives. "We have a saying on Earth," she replied, "never judge a book by its cover." Zrath's mandibles clicked in what might have been laughter. "I do not know what a book is," he admitted, "but I believe I understand your meaning." The ceremony continued, and when it was done, humanity had finally taken its place among the elder races of the galaxy. Not as children to be protected or primitives to be pitied, but as equals, as warriors, as the species that had looked into the face of extinction and refused to blink. The Council never laughed at Earth again. And in the years that followed, whenever a new species emerged into the galactic community and asked about the humans, the elder races would tell them a story. The story of how a small fleet of primitive ships had changed the course of history. The story of how mercy had been mistaken for weakness. And the story of one sentence that had made the most powerful beings in the galaxy realize just how badly they had underestimated the youngest species among them. "You seem to have mistaken our mercy for weakness." It became the most famous sentence in galactic history, and no one who heard it ever forgot what it meant.